Everybody's got a story. You just have to listen. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this is Good Listening. You've probably seen those commercials where TikTok talks about the impact their app has on small businesses and how much money they make because of the app. Well, TikTok also helps authors. You've probably seen the whole BookTok phenomenon and how authors and books are exploding thanks to TikTok. And my guest today is one of those authors. Her name is KL Walther. She blew up a couple years ago on BookTok with the book The Summer of Broken Rules. Well, she is back with her new book, While We're Young. We're going to talk about that book, how she became an author, get into the whole BookTok phenomenon, and what's next for KL Walther. KL, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And so I want to start this conversation by our mutual love of a movie we both really, really love to our bones, and that's Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Now, there is a bit of an age difference between the two of us because I grew up in a time where I actually saw it in the movie theaters in 1986, probably well before you were born. But I want to go back into terms of like why that movie connected with me, because as a Gen Xer, slacker, like Ferris Bueller spoke to our generation, this sort of like ironic detachment from life, like basically just like using humor to get through the shit. So you not being a Gen Xer, I don't want to assume, millennial or Gen Z?
Millennial.
Okay. Tell me why Ferris Bueller connects to millennials, because even though our generations are pretty closely in terms of timelines, very different. Tell me why Ferris connected with you.
Yeah, well, I think high school is such a universal experience. No matter what generation you're from, you attend high school. And that's hard, that's fun at times. And I think the senior skip day, that is another universal experience. Whether you participated in it or not, you know what a senior skip day is. And you love that magic that happens during that day. So that's what I connected with. I was such a goody two shoes, kind of still am. So I was so anxious the first time I watched Ferris Bueller, but I've watched it like umpteenth times now, and it's now a comfort movie for me.
Wait, so does that mean you connected more with Ferris's sister, played by
Oh
Jennifer
my gosh,
Grey?
my brother calls me Jeannie. It's like a running joke in the family. I am Jeannie. I am not, I'm not as angry as Jeannie is, but definitely connected more with Jeannie.
That's a good thing. So you won't be making out with Charlie Sheen in a
Oh,
prison or
no.
no, good to know. All right, so the reason I bring this up for folks not familiar, your book is sort of inspired by Ferris
Mhm.
Bueller's Day Off, While We're Young. Tell me about connecting pop culture to books, because again, here's another Gen X thing. Like before Gen Xers came around, the idea of like referring to pop culture in pop culture was just never happened. I know Quentin Tarantino gets a lot of credit for this, but like you never saw those streams cross. Like in the movies in the 60s and 70s, they would never refer to pop culture. And once, us Gen X came around, we all did it. I mean, you look at music, rappers, is basically half of their songs is pop culture references. So tell me about why it was important connecting those two with the book.
Yeah, so I grew up in a pop culture household. Jennifer Aniston is Jen in my house. Taylor Swift is Taylor. So we're always watching movies, TV shows, stand-up comedy sets, that type of thing. So that is what I'm used to. So writing contemporary fiction, I really wanted to ground my stories in the real world. And Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a movie in the real world. So I loved doing that retelling. But I do mention other shows. I think Squid Game is in there, Taylor Swift is in there, various bands. And so I love doing that. But the tedious part is this book is going to age. So you kind of want to pick references that are going to age. So that's always, I ask for opinions on that. Like I throw in Kendrick Lamar. He's a legend. I think that's going to age well. And then I've picked shows that have been popular the last few years. So I love doing that, but it's more tedious than you think it's going to be when you set out to.
Yeah, you actually, Kayla, you just stole my follow-up question, because a book has a shelf life where it's like you're not, unless it's a mega bestseller, Kayla. Well, God bless, hopefully it is. You're not going to go in and do a reprint or like add a different chapter or something like that. So that I always find that balance interesting, especially when I was just, because SNL just celebrated its 50th, so I was watching old reruns, and like some of these hosts of musical guests, you're like, and I was alive for a lot of this, Kayla. I'm like, who was that? They
Oh,
got
totally.
they got on SNL. So how much? So in terms of writing this book, is that very stressful because you want to keep it contemporary, but you're like, oh my god, if I put this reference in 5 years from now, people are like, what is KL even talking about?
Yes, it's stressful. I do whatever I want first, just to even get words on the page. And then when I go back and revise, I, kind of skim their career. I think about it more. I think about why I love them and why they need to be in the book. And then I ask my mom, who's a Gen Xer. I'll ask my sister, who's a Gen Z, just to make sure there is that crossover and you're going to recognize it and not go, why did they host SNL? Like that type of thing.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So let's talk about this, your home life and becoming a writer, because I think for a lot of people, especially in school, like I want to be an author, or I want to be an actor, and these roles and jobs seem so exotic, but you're like, how do I even do that? Like, Kayla, I spent the majority of my life working in radio, but like I grew up as a kid of immigrant parents. I'm like, how would I make that jump? And I luckily, got an internship. I worked my way up and did all that. But the idea of a writer, it's sort of like I always say, like actors and authors are very entrepreneurial because at first
Yeah.
you're your own boss. No one is going to care more about your work than you do. So tell me about those steps you took for maybe someone who pops this and this comes across on someone's YouTube feed about like, what were those first steps to become a quote unquote professional writer? Because anybody can be a writer and everyone should be a writer if they want to. But the idea of making that like sort of a career, how did that happen for you?
Right. So I like to say anyone who writes is a writer. But for me, you're not an aspiring writer. If you write, you write. I'm just thinking of people's once upon a time their Twitter bios. You don't need to put aspiring in you. If you write, you write. But I grew up devouring books. I always loved to read, especially young adult. And then when I was a sophomore in college, I needed to pick one last class to fill my schedule for the spring. And I was an English major. I loved lit classes, but I had a talk with myself and just said, you can't take an additional lit class. It's going to be too much reading. So I saw fiction writing workshops and I just thought, you love to read. You've kind of thought about writing. Let's take this class and see if you can actually write. So I remember the grad student who taught it. He was amazing. He said, you can submit short stories, or if you're writing a novel, you can submit excerpts of the novel. The idea of writing a short story terrified me. It just terrified me. So I started writing a novel for this class. I think I turned in 3 chapters and you get feedback, and I just became obsessed with it. Um, I wrote outside of class all the time. I played ice hockey at UVA, and we would be on the bus going to games, and I would just be on my computer. And my teammates were so sweet. They'd be like, don't bother her. She's writing a book. So I finished a first manuscript, which no one will ever read. It's very important to me, and it's given me so many ideas and skills, but no one needs to read it. And then I immediately started a second manuscript. There were side characters in the first that I just fell in love with and needed to tell their story. So it wasn't really till I finished the second manuscript that I thought about publishing it. And my professor at the time was a published author, so I chatted with her and she kind of enlightened me about how the process works. And the first step was finding a literary agent. So I started all of that research. And after I very fortunately was offered representation, that's when, the games kicked off to submitting to publishers.
Wow. Yeah. It's funny too how that world works because again, it's like acting where sometimes literary agents, you probably ran into this, don't want to represent someone who hasn't been published already because there's that sort of
Absolutely.
cycle. So was that infuriating to you as well? Because it seemed like the process was pretty steady because you had a mentor, but like, is it infuriating to be like, wait a minute, so I can't get an agent without being published, but I can't be published without being an agent? It's all very confusing to people not in that world.
I never really thought about it that way. I am a very hard worker and put my blinders on to stay in my lane, so to speak. So I just knew I wasn't published and I wanted to, wow an agent so I could be published. I read a lot of different writers' discourse on, Twitter at the time and Instagram, but I never really thought about, well, I haven't done this, so I'm not going to be able to do this. It was just really working hard towards getting what I wanted.
Good for you. But part of that is rejection. And I read this quote of yours that you said, rejection is always a tough pill to swallow. I've written several manuscripts that I love and I believe should have a place on the shelf, but it seemed destined to stay on my laptop instead. Tell me about that part of it, because We just talked about the end of the rainbow thing where you get the agent and you get
Yeah.
published, but along the way there's rejections when it comes to those manuscripts. How did you work through all that?
Yeah, so I did get an agent on my first manuscript, but there were a lot of rejections on that manuscript before that. So one of the reasons was my manuscript was way too long for the genre. That was something I did not research at all. I just wrote the manuscript, but it was 20,000 words too long. So
Whoa.
oh, I know. It was so enlightening. And it's a testament to how much my agent does love my book, my work, because she did offer on that way too long manuscript, and then obviously said, "All right, we're slicing this." But yes, it was always a disappointing day with rejections, and I admit I don't remember all the logic now, but it was the length or the pacing, which is code for the length, or they just didn't connect with the characters, and that's hard for me because I obviously connect so much with the characters. But when I got a rejection, I don't know, I would buy myself, like, a treat. I would talk to my mom about it, and then I would always send out query letters gradually. You don't send out a huge batch at once. That was something I learned. So, if 2 people rejected me, I would send out 2 more queries. So onwards and upwards, I hoped.
So you were basically David Foster Wallace in the world of like beach reads. Is that what you're trying to do? You're like doing a 10,000 page
I
book.
was long. I just loved the characters so much, and oh my gosh, and, it was a boarding school manuscript. I went to boarding school, so I just and my dad did as well, and I had all of this material and just wanted to throw it into one book, so
That's funny. You mentioned a couple times the love of characters, and you've said that a lot of the characters are stitched from real life people. So tell me how that affects your real life. Do your friends and family members be like, "Hey, Kale, is that me you're writing about?" Like, how do you work with that? Because if it is so close to where you're coming from, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people in your life who see themselves in your characters.
so I absolutely do not just drop people into my books. That's not fun for me at all. I usually take threads from different, people, so there's a lot of my sister in my female characters. There's always a dash of me. There's a lot of my cousin, or maybe just this cool girl that I went to school with. Or a male character will have my brother's sense of humor, my godfather's, love of cooking, something like that. But my first book was published a few months after my fifth high school reunion, which is always a big deal. We always come back for that. And I did have dinner with a friend a few days before, and she mentioned the book. And she said, I can't wait to figure out who's who when I read it. And I said, you can try to do that. I don't think you're going to be very successful because that's not how I write. But by all means, go for it. I think you're just going to recognize one colorful teacher who had to be in there.
That's awesome. Good. Well, at least you didn't cause any controversy because
Oh,
sounds like you
no,
have a
not
close knit
not that I
family.
know of.
Not that you know of. Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Now you're one of these many authors that got a nice little spring from BookTok. TikTok has been very important in your career, and I think if you told an author 20 years ago that a social media platform was going to help you launch your career or like grow your career, I think people would have thought like, "Oh, are you crazy?"
Yeah.
Because at that point, it's like Facebook, and no one was really doing other than like those groups and Reddit subthreads. You
Yeah.
never saw anything like that. So tell me about your relationship with TikTok. Was it something that you were embracing from the jump, or was it something that happened organically? And I know now there's probably people like book talk promotion. We'll help you sell your book on TikTok. I'm sure you've seen. I'm sure your inbox is full of stuff like that. So tell me about how your relationship to TikTok and how it helped your books.
So I do not have a TikTok. Just I'm not that technologically advanced to create a video. And then I did have it for a brief period of time, but I loved it so much that it became very distracting to my work. Um, so I deleted it. And then, however many months later, my cousin, who actually she does make TikToks, so she's into it. She texted me that a huge book talker had posted about my book. So from there, it was very organic, the videos. And eventually I was curious and did download TikTok for a time to watch all of these videos. And I'm just so impressed. The, aesthetic videos that are made, they just give me the warm and fuzzies that a book so personal to me, The Summer of Broken Rules, is so relatable and aspirational too. I'm just wowed, honestly, and I feel very, very lucky.
And when you found out that it was going viral on TikTok, were you like, wait a minute, what? How, like to you, since you weren't a TikToker and didn't realize this whole subculture of book talk, were you surprised that that was actual thing?
Oh, well, I'm not surprised because I knew about BookTok and I love the Bookstagram community on Instagram. That's my main social media headquarters. So I know about all of these, above and beyond passionate readers. But yes, I was surprised they narrowed in on my book because I know it's the Hunger Games and all the fantasy books that have, the intense fandoms, which I so admire as well. But again, I'm just so flattered.
It's amazing how books like yours, even like the Colleen Hoovers of the world,
Mhm.
that like find, because again, like you said, it's usually a genre book that has, whether it's a Potter or Lord of the Rings, that has like this
Yes.
like heavy fandom. I mean, I guess the closest thing probably for your generation is probably like the Twilight books to have that
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
fandom. Were you one of those? Were you a Twilight kid?
I had the book on the corner of my desk in 6th grade and would read it, during breaks, and I think that made young adults so accessible for so many people. We were talking about that at a festival a few weeks ago. I was not into the whole series, though I was team Edward, and I did see the movie with my best friend. So I admire it so much. I was not, a diehard fan, though.
Okay. What did you think of the adaptation? Because I think and I'm sure this is probably a part of your life now too, because I'm sure someone's going to be calling KL in the age of like, hey, let's talk about adaptations. But like in terms of like adapting from the way you envision the book to how they executed in the films, what was just, I don't need like a letterbox review or anything like that. But like, what did you feel like? You feel like it captured like what you were reading?
I think it did at some points. I'm 29 now, so it was so long ago, but I think I always looked at adaptations as reinterpretations of the original art. And reading is so subjective. I knew it was never going to capture the exact thing I pictured in the book. And I think that's a pretty healthy way to look at it.
I think the one thing is like it's funny how stuff will play better on a page than it will in movies. For example, and I know you were Team Edward, so the whole thing where Jacob imprinted himself on the baby at the end of the last movie. Like in the book, it probably doesn't seem as creepy, but then when you see
Yeah.
a
Oh,
fully
so
grown
true.
Taylor Lautner like falling in love with a baby on screen, it's like this is freaking weird.
I never got that far. I heard a little bit. It was, ugh. Yeah, I'm not gonna go back and watch that, but
Okay, okay. Yeah, I don't want to put that on you. No, I totally get it. And speaking of adaptations, have you had those conversations with your people? Because now you have people in terms of possibly adapting some of your books.
well, I get a lot of Instagram messages from people wanting me to adapt the books, and I am so just flattered, but at the same time, it is not my decision whether we adapt this book. In some respect, it might be, but there is some interest. I mean, that it seems to be such a hot genre now with The Summer I Turned Pretty being the most recent success. So, I mean, hopefully in the future, I know the last season of The Summer I Turned Pretty is coming out,
Mhm.
summer. So, I think we need our, beachy romance fix after that.
That's awesome. Tell me about the cyclical nature of books, because what I find fascinating is I think it's the only like sort of medium that does this, where you could come across an author's like third or fourth book and be like, holy shit, I love this author. Let me go back and read books one, two, and three. And you see this with a lot of, I mean, Colleen Hoover was an example. She wrote several books
Oh, yeah.
before it ends with us. And then all of a sudden people are like, oh, let me see what oh, I like this Faraday. I like this other book. I mean, going back to Gen Xers like John Grisham, like everyone
Yeah.
thinks The Firm was his first book, and no, it wasn't. And then people go back. Is it funny how people can sort of connect with you like in the not that you're in the middle of your career, but like you've already published a bunch of books and now people are finding you and going back and reading the other books? That must be so cool.
It is. A lot of people think The Summer of Broken Rules is my first book. It's actually my second one. My first was published in June 2020, so lockdown, nothing was open, so it didn't have as splashy a release as we were all hoping. But those characters, again, are so important to me that I always like to say, no, it's the second book, and the characters from the first make appearances in the second. So that's kind of my pitch for why you should go back and read my first one. But I love it. I love when I get a message like they read The Summer of Broken Rules and they loved it so much. I love that I can then point them to my other books so that they get, another fix.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. I wonder it is because I know like in a lot of mediums there is sort of like a highfalutenness to it. Like there's like it's we're just coming off the Oscars, so
Mhm.
movies like Honora and The Brutalist win all these awards where probably like 99% of the population on the planet never even saw those movies. Although personally, I loved Honora; it was my favorite movie last year. But when it comes to books, you have this sort of highfalutenness too. There's like the literature and the elevated fiction, and then obviously the world that you play in. Is that something that because I know sometimes you'll see authors be like striving for like I don't want to be subjected to just this genre. I'm more than this genre. Is that something that gets into your brain, or is this just something that I'm projecting?
Not for me. I love reading on the beach. I want to write books that you can just pop in your tote bag and read on the beach or in between your classes. I love my easy breezy young adult romance. It always, does it for me, and it seems to make a lot of people happy. So I'm going to keep doing it.
Good for you. So no jealousy of like, hey, I guess I'm never going to win a Pulitzer. That's not something
Not
something
really,
that you
not
think
right
about.
now, at least.
Yeah, not right now. Right, right.
Yeah.
It could, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Good for you. In terms of like where you go in terms of your career, you mentioned the fact that you love this genre and writing this, and you've seen a lot of cases where an author who's known for a certain genre will try to, spread their wings and try something else. Have you played with that? Be like, hey, maybe I want to do a historical fiction. I don't know. I'm just throwing up a random genre up
Oh
there.
my
Are
god,
there other genres you want to play with?
it's so funny because I had a launch event earlier this week, and somebody did ask if you could write another genre, what would it be? And I did say historical fiction. I read a lot of historical fiction. My grandparents have been married for almost 70 years. I have all their letters that they wrote back and forth to each other in college, and I love to read them. So maybe I think it would need to be something I don't write on a deadline, though, because I'd like to leisurely research and figure out exactly what I want to do.
Yeah, that seems like it would be a different mindset for you, right? Because
Totally.
a lot of that stuff, what you're writing is from your brain and your heart, where that it's like you actually have to research and look up dates and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
It almost seems like you're back at school doing homework, right, KL?
Mhm. I live in a family of history buffs, though, so I know I'd have plenty of guidance and it'd help.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I do. I really enjoy historical fiction. I'm reading Between Two Fires now, the Christopher Bowman. It's like a horror medieval thing, and it's
Oh,
based
wow.
like during the plague. It's a lot of fun, but also I'll go back and forth and I'll read different genres. I actually
Right.
my system, KL, is like I like to like balance. I'll read a nonfiction and then a fiction, a nonfiction, a fiction, because I'm not one of these people, and I know people like this, KL. I don't know if you're like these that can read multiple books at the same time. I'm not smart enough to do that. Can you do that?
I don't because I'm always writing a book at the same time.
Okay.
So I don't even read young adult while I am drafting a book.
Okay.
It's I don't want to be unintentionally inspired in the wrong way. And there's also a healthy dose or not so healthy of imposter syndrome because the book I am reading, it's been through so many drafts and polished again and again. And while I am just writing, my word vomit first draft, you don't, your mind does not really connect that. You just think this book is so good and mine is so not good. And it's not. So I just set young adult aside for my, drafting breaks.
Oh, good for you. So what do you read when you're drafting? Is that when you go into the non-historical fiction kind of stuff?
Yeah, historical fiction. I love a good young adult fantasy book. And then my fiance is very into history. So he's slowly getting me into the nonfiction history
Very
corner.
nice. So
Mhm.
in terms of like what you've mentioned drafting process, or do you get into the drafting process as soon as you finish? Like you just put out While We're Young. Do you now all of a sudden jump right into the drafting process? Because as people probably don't know, there's like once you've done that first manuscript, that, that is just the beginning of it all. Like
Oh,
there's a
yeah.
lot to go after that. So once that's complete and the book is out, are you immediately on to the next project?
Yeah, because I'm on deadlines, but I take like a week break at least to read my young adult romance that I've been saving to read and to catch up on TV and to with friends and just to relax for a week. And then usually after that, I feel recharged to jump into something else.
That's awesome. And you know, the subject of connecting with your fans, we kind of touched on that earlier, but Robert Pattinson, ironically, we're tying this all together. I feel like it's a Christopher Nolan movie. Ryan Pattinson, famously from the Twilight movies, just gave an interview where he says, I feel like things are turning where fans don't want to know so much about their people that they love, whether it's actors, authors, whatever. And he's, as we all know, famously private. Not like one of those guys who's, you know, popping on TikTok like or have an IG account. And he says, like, I think there's something to be missed about having that mystery. How do you think about that? Like, because it's important, especially for young adult authors, to connect with their fans,
Yeah.
but also like that level of mystery. And I've always found that fascinating because, again, and I will say this, Kale, the Generation X is probably the best generation because it's lived in both these worlds. It was young enough to make the transition into this internet world, but at the same time, remember what it was like before that.
I can see
So
that.
how do you handle that in terms of like what you're able to share and connect with fans?
I love my fans. I'm very in tune with them. I can't answer every Instagram DM anymore, but I did for a long time. I, love hearing how much my books mean to them on all different levels. I am mysterious about some things, I think, whether it's, film rights, for example, because whether or not anything is developing, I can't be totally transparent about that for reasons. And then they are very keen about a Summer of Broken Rules sequel. And so I am mysterious about that. And I also am transparent now because the demand is so high that it has to be the right story. I'm not going to have these characters on the page unless it is the right story for them. And that may happen someday, but
That's cool. And I'm curious because, so like I mentioned, I worked in radio. And so for the first half of my career, there was no social media. So no one knew what I looked
Mhm.
like. But in the latter half of my career, there was social media. Then I would like, not that I was a star by any stretch, Kale, but if I would go out in public in the New York City area, there would be a random person like, hey, I love your show, blah, blah, blah. So how does, and again, not that you're
Yeah,
a TikToker, but you post, selfies and
right.
stuff on Instagram. What are some of those interactions in IRL like? Because it sounds like they're super active online, but in real
Yeah.
life, what's the most random one that you've run into someone?
So I was in Krakow this past October for their big book festival. My Polish publisher brought me over, and that was so surreal. And I did a meet and greet. I had a couple events. And then I was going souvenir shopping with my guide, and my agent had come as well. And I feel someone tug on my sleeve while I was looking at Christmas ornaments. And I turn around, and there's this young girl, and she holds up her phone, and it's a picture of me I had posted earlier that day. And she asks if I'm KL Walther, and I said yes. And then she introduced herself and asked me to sign a few things. And then she thanked me and then went back to her mother. And my guide overheard her mother say, "See, I knew it would happen." And it turns out they couldn't get tickets for the event. But oh, it was so magical.
Wow. I feel like you're living a John Hughes movie, what you're inspired by. That is definitely like a John Hughes end of Home Alone type moment.
Yeah, I definitely, it was very special.
That's so cool. That's awesome. I mean, the great thing about being an author too is the fact that like no matter what happens from this day forward, your books will live on. Like,
Mhm.
is that do you grasp? Are you too young to think about that? The fact that like even if you don't write another book again, and you probably will write another 20 or 30 books, probably. The fact that you've already written these books that have connected with people, the legacy. I'm gonna get really deep here, Cal. Like the legacy of what these books leave behind, and you see, I mean, a little girl in Poland,
Mhm.
you've connected with, like you of all growing up in Pennsylvania, the last thing you probably thought about was like, hey, one day I'm gonna be recognized in Poland. Tell me
Totally.
about what you think about your legacy will look like.
I think I'm a little too young to really wrap my head around that right now, but I remember when The Summer of Broken Rules was published in 2021, my editor sent me an email on release day, and used the phrase perennial favorite when talking about the book. And I was like, oh, I did not, that did not, I did a like, yeah, okay, like we'll see, because I was lacking a little self-confidence. But yes, I mean, we're releasing a special edition of it in May. It blows my mind how connected people are to this book and that they want more from it.
That's awesome. Awesome. Her name is KL Walther. The book is While We're Young. And how weird is, I'm going to say this, New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. Is that freaky? Like having that in front of your words? I mean,
Yeah.
you've written your sort of like epitaph already. It's like that is going to be the first line when they say KL best-selling author. That's pretty cool.
It's the coolest. I never expected it. So it's very much the coolest.
Awesome. KL, thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Good Listen. If you'd like to catch up on past episodes or read up my blogs, go to joepardavila.com. If you enjoyed this episode and watching it on YouTube, hit that old thumbs up button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps my channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, a 5-star review would be greatly appreciated. Thanks very much for joining us. We will see you next time. Adios.